Hello everybody and welcome back to Beastcoast Pokemon. Today, James Beck and I are going to break down the two major in-person tournaments for Series 1 VGC. Hey guys, Cyber. Relax, I was just gonna get there. Anyway, as this little buddy was saying, 80% of you aren't subscribed to the channel, so hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Hey, what Pokemon are you? We're actually wrapping up the Series 1 VGC format and we'll be moving to Series 2, which of course will allow for Paradox Pokemon. And so we only had a couple of months with this format, but I think it's considered by many to be one of the most enjoyable VGC formats in many, many years. James, I don't know how you feel about that, but yeah, we're here to just kind of break down the events. And of course, James did very well at the first tournament, San Diego Regionals, and I commentated that tournament as well. So we're here to kind of just analyze everything. But James, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Aaron, and yeah, it's kind of crazy how there's only been 3 regionals and only one in the US and one in Europe, and then of course the other one that happened in Taiwan like in December. So yeah, only 3 regionals for the series, and we never really got to experiment with the short series back in the Sword and Shield era because of all that craziness that just happened over those couple of years. But yeah, it really does feel like a blur right now.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about Series 1 in particular is it felt like the metagame evolved really rapidly. I think in this video we'll be focusing on San Diego and Liverpool, which were the 2 tournaments that took place, in January. But there was a regionals over in Taiwan, and if you look at the teams that dominated there, it was like a lot of Murkrow plus, like Mousehold teams. And in both San Diego and Liverpool, I feel like the format shifted way towards like bulkier teams. We saw some brand new Pokemon pop up that we'll talk about a little bit in depth, but things like Paldea and Tauros, as well as King Gambit and Baxcalibur, for example. Of course, Garganacl won the San Diego Regionals. So yeah, let's just dive into things. We're first going to take a look at like usage stats from San Diego Regionals, and this kind of just breaks down how many Pokemon were used on the top 128 teams and how frequently they were used, essentially. And so, yeah, pulling it up here, I think it's interesting. I definitely expected Golden Go to be popular, but to see it on over 50% of teams, I think is absolutely wild.
Yeah, it's just a really good mon. I mean, it has fantastic stats across the board, really good bulk, a special attack. Let's not forget about, of course, its signature Make It Rain, which is a very powerful spread steel type move. And with Terra Steel especially, it does a lot. We've seen a lot of choice specs on the Golden Goes, but we've also seen some variants, of course. Nasty Plot is an incredible setup move, especially with that spread Make It Rain. Makes it really hard to actually switch in. It's just a solid overall good mon. Its ability is absolutely crazy too, because it ignores all status moves like Amoonguss Spore. You can't get Encored unless it's like a Mode Breaker Tinkaton or Taunted or anything of those sorts. So it's a really big mon that's hard to shut down without just brute offensing it.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned its ability, and like Amoonguss is at number 2. Amoonguss usage actually was a lot higher at San Diego Regionals than I thought. I'm curious about your take on it, James, but yeah, I didn't expect to see it be this popular. It's a really good Pokemon, and Sleep, of course, is a really good status condition as well. But yeah, I wouldn't have predicted to be at number 2. Meowscarada would have been my pick at number 2, and of course, it's right under the Amoonguss, but yeah, Amoonguss really making a huge comeback here.
Yeah, Amoonguss is just really solid. If you actually look at the top pairs you see out of the 128 teams, it's actually Amoonguss and Golden Go. And this is a combo that I actually use a lot during the regional championship since I had both of them on the team. And it's just really solid because both of them are really tanky. You can Nasty Plot, you have Spore setup, Rage Powder Redirection, of course. And I think the big one is that Pollen Puff actually does work on Golden Go. So being able to Nasty Plot, take some damage, and then you could just heal back with Pollen Puff is absolutely crazy. And it really just allows Golden Go to stick around, get those Nasty Plots set up, and just do a bunch of damage after the boost. So yeah, I don't think it's really that much of a surprise. It was just really strong. You saw a bunch of them on Rain teams, and even without Rain, I think this was just such a solid combination. And yeah, it's just so good.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Rain, because I think if I look at, like the top 10 Pokemon here, in terms of the top 128 teams, there wasn't anything that was like too surprising. I think King Gambit at 4th was a little bit higher than I had expected. But overall, like, all of these Pokemon made sense. But I think one of the things from San Diego Regionals was the rise of Pelipper. So here it was, number 15, used on 21 different teams in the top 128. But it also was seen kind of all over the top cut as well, as it was the 6th most represented Pokemon in top cut, being on 7 of the 32 teams. And so, yeah, I think Pelipper was something I kind of had on my radar. I just didn't think it would be that strong in San Diego, and it looked really good. And, there were different ways people were utilizing it. For example, we saw a Dreadnought with Pelipper in the top 4, but we also saw Pelipper with, like, Palafin, for example, and then it enables, gets rid of, like, the weaknesses or fire weakness from, like, Golden Go and King Gambit, for example. And so this was one of the Pokemon that I think really stuck out as, like, a rising star from that tournament.
Yeah, Pelipper is interesting. I definitely think we've talked about how Rain was probably like very underrated this format, but I didn't think Pelipper would make that much of a splash this competition. And we'll just continue seeing it as we go on. But really, like, I guess its utility is just incredible, right? You have Tailwind, you have Wide Guard support, which Pelipper gets. Very few Pokemon get access to that, so that's pretty nice. Its Hydro Pump and Hurricanes do a ton of damage as well. And it's a pretty decently defensive Pokemon. Its special defense isn't that great, but if you invest in it, it's not too bad. So yeah, it's a pretty nice mon. We've seen the Palafin combo, like you said before. We saw the Dreadnought, and we also saw, for instance, some Tauros teams, which Tauros really picked up in this competition. The ones on Pelipper were like Choice Scarf with like Wave Crash or Raging Bull to do a ton of damage in the rain. But yeah, one of the things that I think made the biggest splash was Tauros, a Pokemon we really didn't see much until this tournament.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because it was the 11th most represented Pokemon in the top 128 teams, and then the 5th most represented Pokemon in the top 32 teams. There were 10 players that had Tauros in the top 32, and I agree with you. This really came out of nowhere for me. Like, I, played a fair amount of ladder before San Diego just to make content, and even practicing with people, I knew, like, it picked up a little bit, especially on kind of those, like, bulkier oriented teams. And yeah, it's a really interesting kind of way to deal with Dondozo because you can cycle in the Intimidates while also resisting Wave Crash, so it makes sense. But I would not have predicted this to be the 5th most represented Pokemon in the top cut. And so, yeah, I think we saw it in a bunch of different compositions, but overall, I think one of the really interesting trends was also Mirror being used on this Pokemon, allowing you to, for example, activate Defiant on opposing King Gambits and then get a +2 attack boost immediately. I had never really seen interesting applications of Mirror before San Diego, and then like this with Tauros I thought was cool, and it actually activated on stream a lot. So yeah, I think if I'm looking at like the Pokemon in top cut, King Gambit really high, Tauros and Pelipper absolutely smashed in this tournament, and then Baxcalibur, of course, ended up being on the winning team and was the 7th most represented Pokemon here.
Yeah, Baxcalibur is just an interesting Pokemon because it has really great stats. You actually said, I think, in the beginning of Series 1 that you thought Baxcalibur had so much potential. And you are right, Aaron. It did have a lot of potential. It has done a lot, especially since most of the players, I believe, opted for the loaded dice set with Icicle Spear. Yeah. And of course, that allows you to always get at least minimum 4 hits and sometimes that 5 hits. So that's a 100 base power move right there from a Baxcalibur that also goes through like Focus Sash, which is pretty nice on a Pokemon like this. Strong Ice Shard could run Terras, and with a Terra, like, it covers the ice typing that generally isn't the best defensively, but overall it's great offensively. And then when you change to a different Terra type, it can really tank the hits extremely well. So not too surprising to see Baxcalibur, but yeah, definitely a bit more than I was anticipating this top cut especially.
Yeah, and it definitely, if you watch the finals from San Diego Regionals, felt like one of the MVPs. It was basically necessary in order to beat, like, Dragon Terra Dondozo, and the way that Chisak, who ended up winning the tournament, played in the finals against, like, Dragon Terra Dondozo. It was really cool to see. But I think, I'm now looking kind of shifting towards the top 32 stats, and Talonflame had pretty big representation, and James, you were partially responsible for that using Talonflame. And then Murkrow really just like completely fell off in terms of top cut representation. There were only 2 Murkrows in top 32, whereas 6 Talonflames. So, I mean, James, what was your decision to kind of choose Talonflame for this tournament?
So I like Talonflame because it wasn't something like I absolutely needed, but I really liked the idea of how it complements my core, where you could just have a fast Tailwind, but also the fire coverage, I think, to actually hit Golden Go is really nice. So I think Murkrow is a Pokemon that's a little bit predictable in a way where you can get the Tailwind up, but it's not exactly amazing because its damage output, unless you're using like max attack, Focus Sash, Brave Bird, or like Foul Play on an actual strong attacking mon, it isn't really going to be able to do that much other than just go for Tailwind, maybe a Haze. It can taunt, but it usually doesn't stick around long enough. And it's not really a threat, so you could actually just leave it alone. It's not that big of a deal to handle. But Talonflame can actually do a bunch of damage or just give better support, because it's actually, if you invest in it with bulk, Talonflame can actually take hits well. We've seen it on a few teams. There were a few support Talonflames and a few of the offensive ones. I believe the ones that made top 8, which were Geo and Amelia, were both more of the defensive Talonflames, while there were still some maybe like Life Orb sets that I did run personally. And yeah, I think both of them are just great. The Priority Brave Bird is also something that you really have to watch out for. So it's just a great, I think it was a good mod, and it really did work extremely well on a lot of teams over, I think, Murkrow, which the benefit of Haze, of course, is Dondozo, which we did see. But of course, one of the issues is they could play around that, right? You can get rid of the Murkrow, or you could play around the Murkrow, and Murkrow's not exactly super bulky, so you could pretty much eliminate it pretty quickly.
Totally. I think, yeah, like one thing that's cool is there were like 47 unique Pokemon out of the top 32 teams, and there were a lot of like one-ofs. You know, we saw like Medicham, Sableye, Scizor, Dreadnought, which made it to top 4, Satitan, you know, Abomasnow. And so, yeah, I don't know. This metagame just felt really fun. San Diego, I felt like, was one of the coolest, like, first, you know, tournament of the season events that we've had for a brand new generation. And so, taking a look actually at the top 32 teams now, there was, you know, a lot of cool stuff across the board. I think a lot of interesting trends, right? First of all, these teams were actually a lot, like, I would say bulkier than I expected it to. Maybe partially is because the lack of, like, Murkrow, maybe hyper offense overall. But yeah, I think there was just a lot of kind of unique archetypes and playstyles that we saw, especially on stream, which I enjoyed a lot. And overall, Chisock Lee was the winner with a Garganacl. Now, Garganacl was actually not very common in this top 32 at all. I think in terms of usage rates, maybe there were 3 in total. Yeah, there were 3 in top 32, but it did end up winning the tournament. And of course, it had that Poison Terra as well. So, yeah, what'd you think about Garganacl as a call for this tournament?
Yeah, it's actually funny because Garganacl was, I had a version of my team of Garganacl over Glimmora, and Garganacl I think is still a pretty good mod. Now, it is different compared to what we saw previously, where most of them were like the Iron Defense Body Press sets, but this one was just like full support with like Salt Cure, Recover, Wide Guard, and Protect. It's really just able to sit there and kind of just like chip away at teams, and some teams just cannot break through the poison typing Garganacl because a neutral hit isn't doing so much to Garganacl, while it can just recover and wait for the Salt Cure. So definitely an interesting tech. I know he said he ran it because he was worried about like the T-spikes from Glimmora and wanted to get rid of those, but it is still a pretty strong wall that's really hard to break through at times.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, this Pokemon I feel like is going to be one of the most contentious in terms of pronunciation. I think the commentators were told it's Garganacl, which is actually how I was pronouncing it. You know,
wait, that was how everyone kept telling me that was wrong, and that's how I pronounced it.
I know exactly. And even now, people are like, "No, you're wrong. It's yeah, Garganacl." And so I'm like, looking at this pronunciation guide, I'm like, is this the right way to pronounce it? But hey, I think this one's gonna be one of those controversial ones. But I definitely agree with everything you said. I thought Chisock's team was interesting because it had that. It also had Mimikyu, the Tauros, and the Baxcalibur, right? Just like a lot of Pokemon that, you know, it's seen some use, but I would say I didn't expect to maybe rise all the way to the top. It was also interesting because it just didn't have any actual like speed control, but it didn't really need it because it had so much offense between like Choice Specs Golden Go, the Life Orb, Mimikyu, you know, Meowscarada, and Baxcalibur. But then Garganacl can just stay on the field essentially for almost forever and just Soul Cure and recover up. And so, yeah, I don't know. The top 32 teams were so cool. I think like Pelipper, Palafin as like a duo feels like it really had a lot of representation within this top 32. Palafin in general, I think, really impressed me throughout the course of the tournament. And yeah, I'd say one of the trends was Murkrow definitely kind of falling off in usage. And you mentioned Glimmora, which is one of the last Pokemon I wanted to talk about as we covered this tournament, since, you know, of course, you used it to get top 32, and Emilio used it to get top 8. So what did you think about this Pokemon, and how did you pick it for your team?
So Emilio and I were working for our teams on San Diego, and we were talking, and I needed something that could really hit the bulky fires, and he was telling me about Glimmora and how he was considering it for San Diego, and I thought, okay, it actually makes a lot of sense for a lot of my team because I like the ability to just do a lot of damage because I kind of needed a wall breaker. So he was testing Choice Specs Glimmora. He kind of gave me the same idea. We were considering some bulky sets as well, but we both ended up sticking to choice specs, and it's pretty incredible because, for instance, it's one of the few Pokemon that could actually like one-shot a Golden Go. For instance, choice specs overpower can actually just obliterate Golden Go. It can just do a lot of damage to like Sylveon. The T-Spikes can actually be very valuable because you can chip away at opposing Dundozo, especially for his team. In the mirror, that could be really nice if they're not rest, because you could always just win the Dundozo mirror if that's the case, if you have one layer of T-Spikes up and the Dundozo gets caught in it. So it was really cool to see it on his team specifically, but on my team, we could activate it as well. It could just break Focus Ashes. It did a lot of damage to, again, those fire types that I felt were pretty pesky for my team. And it does pretty well in the Dundozo stuff because a lot of Dundozo partners are just really weak to Glamora offensively.
Totally agreed. Yeah, I think overall, as we wrap up, San Diego, my takeaways where it feels like hyper offense tailwind, especially with Murkrow, really fell off. Dundozo Tatsugiri did okay. Of course, they made it all the way to the finals, and I think there were 5 players in top 32 that had it. And so, one of the interesting trends was what kind of Tatsugiri form you use. Some opted to move away from plus attack into plus speed, which I thought was interesting. Generally, the teams in top 32 felt a lot bulkier. Pelipper, Tauros, Baxcalibur felt like some of the biggest winners in terms of usage rates. Whereas I actually expected like Armor's Entity to have a little bit more representation, and that feels like that core just didn't do super well within the top 32. But overall, I felt like there was a pretty interesting trend of moving towards bulkier Pokemon, and then Intimidate really coming back into the format with so many teams having things like the Salamence or the Tauros, and we even saw like Gyarados in top 32 as well. So those are some of my main takeaways. I'm not sure, what you were thinking about it.
No, yeah, especially with the Intimidate. I think because stuff like Clear Amulets hasn't really been used because of the lack of Intimidate, it just made a lot of sense. Also, it was just pretty interesting because there were a few Pokemon that I kind of expected to do really well at this event that kind of just fell off. Like we saw Murkrow, but one of the biggest lacks, I think, compared to like some of the rest of the format we've seen is Garchomp. We kind of did not see many Garchomps at all. I think Brady, Alberto, and I think that was pretty much it. I don't think there's another Garchomp. So a few Pokemon definitely fell off here, and it was a little bit interesting to see. But of course, then again, you saw the rise of like Pokemon that do really well against it.
Exactly. So yeah,
that's Sand.
Yep, that is it for San Diego here. Actually, I guess the one thing that's catching my eye as we wrap things up was I feel like Dragonite actually did quite well in Top Cut as well. I mean, it didn't like make it all the way to the end, but there were a lot of different Dragonites, and I feel like at first when Scarlet and Violet came out, everyone's like, oh, Choice Band Dragonite, but then we started seeing people move towards like Multi-Skill plus Assault Vest, for example. So yeah, it's just kind of cool to see Dragonite really have maybe its best VGC season yet.
Absolutely, but let's move on to the Liverpool Regional Championship, and this one just happened recently. It was the last official event for Series 1, and yeah, it was definitely a very unique tournament experience.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is talking about Dundozo Tatsugiri. Dundozo Tatsugiri actually, I'd say, had a little bit more representation at this tournament. Like, for example, out of the top 32 teams, there were 10 Dundozo and Tatsugiris. But it's interesting, if you look at the Pokemon at the top, generally a lot are similar to what we saw from San Diego. So it felt like San Diego was, good inspiration for the players at Liverpool, which makes sense, right? There wasn't that much time between these two tournaments, and San Diego felt like a pretty big shift in the meta. One thing that is interesting, though, is if you look at like the top Pokemon on the top cut teams from Liverpool, Palma was actually on 9 of the top 32 teams and ended up winning the entire tournament. Palma made it to the finals of San Diego, but didn't see as much usage in that tournament. Palafin with 8 on 8 of the top 32 teams. And then Tauros kind of fell off a little bit in usage. It was only on 5 of the top 32 teams. Similarly, like, Baxcalibur only on 3 of the top 32 teams. Murkrow, once again, not doing super well, only on 3 of the top 32 teams, but ended up winning the tournament, right? So it's like Murkrow can still be really good, and actually the winning team had Murkrow as well as Dundozo Tatsugiri, as well as the Palma, which was kind of an interesting core. But yeah, I think, a lot of the results here kind of mirror what we saw in San Diego, just some Pokemon, seeing a little bit more usage than others, and others falling off. But I don't think Liverpool had any like things that were super crazy in terms of totally reinventing the wheel, although we did see a Hard Trick Room team make it all the way to the finals.
Yeah, that Hard Trick Room team was definitely something that kind of shocked, because you've seen Armor's Entity, but then And we saw like the Scarf Final Gambit Annihilate, which did have a representation at San Diego, but not on Hard Trick Room. It was more on Dundozo, but it was pretty interesting to see like a resurgence. We even saw Hattering, for instance, which I don't think we've seen that Pokemon in a while, especially because it lost Expanding Force. But yeah, it was just pretty interesting to see how Alex Soto did play this Hard Trick Room team. And I think that's because it had a lot of tools for general matchups, and you can pretty much flowchart a lot based on the team sheet of how to get Trick Room up and then sweep, because you had a lot of offensive pressure with the Torkoal. One of the few Torkoals, actually probably like one of the only Torkoals I'm pretty sure at this event. And yeah, there were 10 Pelipers as well, so I guess it was pretty good into the rain teams, but also this Psychic Terrain helping out against a lot of the Palafins we see in this tournament, with that Psychic Terrain denying the Jet Punch. So a lot of options I think that this team had just for getting a Trick Room, because it had 3 Trick Room setters, but also just doing a lot of damage inside Trick Room.
Yeah, what's really interesting is if you look at like the top 32 usage stats, like there were only 2 Annihilates, 2 Torkoals, 1 Armor Rouge, 1 Hattering, right? 1 Indeedee actually. And so Alex was basically representing all of these Pokemon on his team. And I think a lot of people were probably just not prepared for kind of Hard Trick Room, right? I feel like Hard Trick Room is something that always is really strong, especially earlier on in formats. And I feel like the way that the metagame had progressed, people, especially if you look at this top 8 bracket, for example, right? There are a lot of like super bulky teams that are similar to what we saw at San Diego, right? Like Pokemon that can just deal a lot of damage, but also like aren't necessarily at risk of getting one shot. But Alex's team is like, hey, I am just going to set up Trick Room. Like I think he had Trick Room on Armor Rouge, Indeedee, and Hattering. So it's like 3 Trick Room options, but you also have the Choice Scarf, Final Gambit, Annihilate to, you know, KO something as you set up Trick Room. There was Clear Smog on the Torkoal as well. So that was kind of a nice answer into Dundozo teams. And the idea is to just overwhelm your opponent with offense like very, very quickly. So that was the one team that I think that really caught my eye. I also really liked Francesco Pardini's team. Like it had just a lot of really interesting options, right? It was like Fire, Tauros, Gastrodon, Dragapult, Dragonite, the Glimmora, and the Garganacl. And so, yeah, like those 2 teams I think caught my eye in particular. The rest of the teams, for example, in top 8, I thought were fairly similar to the trends that we had seen from San Diego. But yeah, once again, I think that makes a lot of sense given the, you know, short amount of time between the 2 events.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of curious on if they just took a bit of inspiration and made a twist, especially because it was the last series 1 event, so it wasn't like you had to like make a groundbreaking team, I suppose, because most of it you already saw from San Diego. So probably just either had the team already or like just took a little bit of inspiration, maybe patched up some matchups, which Luca Paz did end up making a few changes after San Diego and going all the way and invading Liverpool from the United States. So definitely some interesting picks. I mean, a lot of the teams we've pretty much seen before. I think one of the things that was pretty interesting to note this tournament was the rise of Gastrodon. There were a lot of Gastrodon actually in this top 32, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's okay into Dundozo if you have the Clear Smog, but Storm Drain, of course, you're able to take the attacks decently well. You have the ability to shut down Palafin because all they really run is water type moves. So if you have a Gastrodon, yeah, it's going to be really hard to break through the Gastrodon so your Palafin can really sweep, or any other like strong water types. So yeah, it was just really interesting to see that. We saw a few defensive teams with like Glimmora, which I thought were pretty interesting. Like we saw, I believe we saw Toxic Glimmora get into top 4, and yeah, that was on Faye's team. And yeah, just definitely a few interesting takes, I think, on these teams that we've pretty much have seen before, but a little bit of a twist.
Yeah, exactly. I'd say like if you're comparing this to San Diego, a lot of the trends are similar to me. Like, you know, Pelipper really had a great performance in San Diego. If you look at the top 32 teams, there's so much Pelipper. It's funny, if you look at the bracket, there's this one like quadrant that's literally like all of them have Pelipper, Palafin, like all 4 of the players, and their teams are super similar to each other, and somehow they just all ended up on the same side of the bracket. But like there's 4 down there, Pelipper, Palafin, you know, represented a bunch on the upper half of the bracket. I think there was at least like 8 Pelipper, Palafin duos, and so that, you know, duo just really rose very quickly. And so yeah, Pelipper feels like one of the biggest winners from, you know, this last month of Series 1. Palmot we talked about a little bit, but that of course ended up winning the tournament and actually had decent representation in the top 32. Not that many made it to the top 8. I think in the end, out of all the Palmots, only 2 advanced to the top 8. but you know, was of course able to win the entire tournament. So it's cool because if you look at the team that like won the whole thing as well as the team that finished second, like it's exactly like you mentioned. It's, you know, at least for first place, it's taking a team or an archetype that's popular and then like adjusting it slightly. Like I actually feel like Tailwind plus Dondozo Tatsugiri was not really seen that often, right? Like Murkrow plus Dondozo Tatsugiri, I had not faced against very much, and having tried the team, I think it makes sense because opposing Dondozo Tatsugiri can kind of be a nightmare. So having Murkrow really is just as a, you know, easy answer, just come in and click Priority Haze against opposing teams is nice. But in the end, you know, you use some of the strongest Pokemon, but also had this Palma and the Murkrow to really, you know, take home the victory. And similar to San Diego, I feel like a lot of the Pokemon were things people expected to be fairly strong, but then the combination of all of them put together was fairly unique, and then of course ended up winning the tournament.
Absolutely, but I think that pretty much covers anything. Is there anything you want to go on over for this last regional championship of Series 1, or should we just go to the what we thought about Series 1?
Yeah, I'd say overall, like, Liverpool, you know, is a good example of how, like, metagames evolve, right? I think, like, San Diego was like, oh, this is the first event of the year. What are people going to use, right? And there were, in my opinion, a lot of things I personally didn't expect to rise, right? We talked about Tauros, we talked about Pelipper, and then Cheeselock's team was fairly unique as well. And then Liverpool was just shortly after, and so it's like you said, it's kind of hard to reinvent the wheel completely, especially when you know they're kind of archetypes that have already been established. And so as a result, it's a lot of modifications and people finding what really works for them. But Alex Soto with this Hard Trick Room team, I really think Hard Trick Room saw very little play throughout all of Series 1. I always felt like it was like a little bit underrated, and Alex made it look really good. And like there was one game I think he had on stream where his opponent just literally couldn't do anything because they had no matchup into it. And I felt like I had seen a fair amount of players be like, yeah, I just literally had no answer into Alex's team. And so that's cool, right? Because he made a metagame call saying, look, this team is simple, it's easy to execute. I just don't think people are going to know really how to play against it. But in the end, yeah, Liverpool followed San Diego, and this is where I wish we had more time to see how the metagame would have developed. I'm curious, you know, if Dondozo Tatsugiri would have continued to dominate the format. Of course, they finished second in San Diego, first in this tournament. It's not necessarily always the easiest to use against high-level players, but, you know, players have made it work. So I wish we had more time to develop this format, but overall, I thought it was really fun to watch, and it was really fun to play as well.
Yeah, I thought for me, building was a little bit annoying. There were, of course, a few Pokemon that did feel like just a little bit tricky to handle because you had to deal with like Annihilate that could just easily sweep teams. You had, of course, the Dondozo combination, and then Golden Go, of course, really hard to break through sometimes. But overall, I felt that otherwise, it was really one of the most fun things to play. And Series 2, I kind of feel where it's more fun to build because you have a lot of options, but Series 2, like some of the Pokemon is just like really annoying to play against, I guess, just because of the nature of how the Paradox Mons are built.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think if I had to summarize Series 1, you know, we obviously played this format for a couple of months. We first of all started with the regionals in Taiwan, and yeah, that tournament I think looked very similar to what you would have expected from the early metagame, right? I'm actually going to try to pull up the results for it right now, but basically it was Murkrow everywhere. And in fact, like, I remember like the results for this came out and everyone's like, oh, there's so little variety from like this format, like everyone's just using Murkrow hyper offense. And then it completely changed once we moved into San Diego. And, you know, this first tournament in Taiwan was just so early on. It was literally on December 10th, right? So, like, we barely even had that much time with the game. And, yeah, that one ended up being, like, just so many Murkrow, Hydreigon, Armarouge teams. And it seemed like that metagame had developed over in, Taiwan. And then you move to San Diego, and the teams are completely different. Rain pops up out of nowhere. Teams get a lot bulkier. Garganacl wins. And then Liverpool is kind of a similar version of that. So, yeah, overall, it is a shame, honestly. We don't have more time to see this metagame develop, but I think there was a lot more room for it to grow, and I think there was, honestly, a lot of diversity in terms of team comps throughout this format.
Yes, that is the case, but unfortunately, we're moving on to Series 2, and pretty exciting to see, I think, if these team compositions we saw in Series 1 will evolve with the Paradox Mons. Will they stay the same, or will they be completely reinvented, or maybe even just not viable anymore because of those Paradox Mons? I think it'll be very interesting to see how it will go. But that's going to be it for us at Beastcoast Pokemon, and us just saying goodbye to Series 1, as this was a very fun metagame once again. It's just a shame to see it go so early, but if you did enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like down below. It really does help us out. Let us know if you want to see more recaps. We'll be doing this for Series 2, of course, and beyond. Any last words, Aaron?
Yeah, just let us know how you felt about the Series 1 metagame, looking at these tournaments, if you watched them, any surprises, any things that, you thought were maybe underrated, that should have done a little bit better in the format, or things that overperformed. And yeah, let us know what Pokemon you think from Series 1 will either increase in popularity going to Series 2 or decrease in popularity. I think, James and I have talked about this before on some of the other content that we've done, but I think, James, you mentioned Gastrodon maybe picking up in usage, and I think were you saying like Meowscarada you might expect to decrease a lot in usage?
Yes, that is correct. Meowscarada definitely. I think we all agreed Meowscarada was going to go down usage, and Gastrodon definitely, like, it had good usage towards the end of Series 1, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it more in Series 2.
Absolutely. Let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below, and thanks as always for joining us as we say goodbye to Series 1. See you in Series 2.